Everyone who exalts himself shall be humbled. Is that not true in daily life? In the Dream of Scipio, classical text going back to pre-Christian times, we have this line. It is something which is valid even in philosophy tout court, spirituality in general, and which we can take with us. As to what people will say of you, let them think of it, for they will say it anyway. In the manuscript from Purgatory, which I translated way back in the 80s, there was this line there coming back from the nun in Purgatory, which was correcting the one who was taking on herself her purgatory in this world, the other nun. This bit of advice: if people are criticizing you, do not defend yourself or lose your peace. For what does it matter what other people think? Now, the point is this: if she were genuinely looking at Jesus, it would be sufficient to have him as judge, and actually to delight in a small part in his victimhood. Jesus autem tacebat. Jesus was silent before Pilate, thereby maintaining his dignity. I received a text which is very relevant to this. It is from a Jesuit, John Horden, I believe, who said that heaven was the humiliation, rather the glorification of humiliation, of humility, and hell, the humiliation of pride. There is a complete reversal. If one observes casually but penetratingly the behavior of certain people who come to the public eye, is it or is it not true that one observes frequently a pattern emerging? The more fame a soul acquires, the more self-sufficiently it presumes to own and have a right to be someone. The more it is self-sufficient, the more then it actually changes mode both towards other people and towards life, and indeed, presumably, towards its own self. It's not the safest way to steer through life. And many are the cases of people at the height of fame who have had a sudden end. And there, of course, it all begins, exactly as they are, nude and crude before the eyes of the judge. In liturgy, classical liturgy, both East and West, there is an education to the person towards nothingness. If one looks carefully at some of the wording in the prayers, it is all a genuine recognition of what we are and are not. And the advantage of the old rite is that there is a fear and trembling inbuilt. One does not crash from the sacristy to the consecration. One comes step by step in utter nothingness, almost prostrate before Majesty, begging forgiveness and purification, and then, and only then, one penetrates into that cloud of glory. I remember hearing that and giving a retreat in a Benedictine monastery in France. They had the old rite there. It was the daughter house of Fongambeau. And one of the fathers just commented casually, The great thing about the old rite is that it's full of doxologies. In other words, one is completely bathed in the Blessed Trinity and therefore in one's own nothingness before it. The Lord has given us a reminder on a regular basis of that nothingness. It is the sacrament that brings us back to our reality. And one sees every time one has to do with a soul, and one's own soul for that matter, how seriously that soul and our own soul is taking seriously the question of its eternity when it comes to the quality of its confession. Souls are, at that point, if they're sincere, genuinely authentic and honest. They have nothing to hide. And to obtain the graces of confession, one needs to make a complete one and a felt one. Now that is something that doesn't always happen. The priest who had a near-death experience and actually was going the wrong way, Father Stephen Shire, who's still alive and giving his testimony, had this to say when he'd come to, eventually, when he was questioned, because he had been going to confession regularly, that there is this problem about going to confession without actually doing anything about it. It was a misuse of the grace to go to confession and to repeat things which one had no intention of doing anything about. At least at that point, to be sincere means to have genuinely a resolution to avoid what one is confessing. Otherwise, one is abusing and therefore not receiving the fullness of grace. One is deflecting it, and it can cause us harm if genuinely we are abusing it at that point. We cannot mock God. So humility is honesty before Him and before ourselves. There are certain indications of the presence or absence of humility. In specifically church circles, there are specific faults against this. I remember when a young priest coming up against a problem very early on in Italy. It's not the same everywhere, but one does find it. One finds oneself being manipulated as a priest. One finds that people are hanging around in the sanctuary, that people are controlling the priest and are reluctant to get out of the sanctuary. They can be there right through the celebration. They can be doing all kinds of things without being asked to. They can be presuming to do all the readings. They can be presuming just to have to be there and to be more or less the main celebrant, and using the priest as a puppet. Now, that's not actually so ridiculous a situation as one thinks it is. It's subtly there quite a lot if one looks around. A priest is actually often controlled, and one observes that a lot of people show that they are obtaining a certain gratification from being visible, from having roles of visible importance. It's a subtle form of pride. Another is if in conversation we, without realizing it, willingly and repeatedly start to orientate the conversation towards ourselves. We say things which we know to be glorious to ourselves, sometimes with great protestations of humility as a preface, but it comes out. Another is simply to be guiding the conversation, to let the conversation follow what we want to talk about, and to do the talking. It's a subtle form of being center stage and therefore pride in action. Another is to exert authority indirectly. Certain people are very good at it. They know exactly how to obtain their will. And for peace's sake, a person will back down from what could be a potential scene. Power, indirectly but very powerfully wielded. Observe life. It's everywhere. Humility is also delicacy and love. To go through life without even mentally making categories and saying to oneself, when the Lord presents someone to us out of the blue, this person is the only person in the whole cosmos at this time. I will give that person all my attention. I will listen to what that person has to say. I will try to see what that person is seeing. That person's problem is the most important problem in the universe at that moment. That demands abdication of the throne, letting the person be. I remember in the past many times finding that even actually in the cloisters of the world, this element of letting a person be wasn't always there. E.g., one would come with a problem, within community perhaps, and what did one find? One had started the problem, and what was the first reaction? A flow of words, an immediate answer, which answered the whole problem, without knowing what the problem really was. Not being allowed to be allowed to express oneself. That courtesy of giving space. It's a secret, and it cannot be without humility. Profound humility, which sits back and lets happen. We can go through life wanting the limelight. One can go through life wanting the maximum in exams, in the university, in the career, in the sports field, on the screen even. At La Trappe in France, I heard on the grapevine that many used to enter La Trappe and prefer to be hidden forevermore, even though they could be ordained, because the brothers were completely hidden, and you'd have sometimes in there university professors or the equivalent who opted for the brotherhood, wanting just to be hidden and never seen, only heard by God. No glory in this life, but boy, what would their eyes see 1 second after death? And this was all maintained precisely by what you can just about see there. The weekly cleansing of the soul, heart-to-heart surgery, where somebody cared, somebody understood, and somebody stepped aside and listened and let be. I just finish with a reference to what happened a century ago this year. As you know, it's 100 years since the First World War broke out. It had been noticed by Protestants that there was a difference between the Catholics and the Anglicans out there. Listen to this. A writer to the Evening Standard stated that he would rather see our country a German province 10 times over than that we should return to Roman Catholicism and idolatry. The remark drew the following testimony from an English officer on active service. May I say how impressed I have been by the extraordinary religion of the people among whom we are campaigning. I have seized every opportunity of attending churches wherever we have been, and of observing the people and their habits. I find everywhere a magnificent piety. Now that's linked to humility, isn't it? A religion which guides and fills out the lives of these people. The French soldiers go into the trenches, each with his little medal of Our Lady hung around his neck. They pray aloud in action, not in fear, as we very well know, but with a high courage and a great trust. It is my grief that our poor boys have not the same knowledge to lean on, the same precious comfort in their times of trial and need. As regards confession, it's the most important point of a person's existence on this side of time. In the hall of a great railway terminus in Paris, a number of wounded were laid out on the straw, waiting to be taken to a hospital. 8 of them were very badly hurt, and some of them were evidently not long for this world. One of them seemed to be very uneasy. A nurse went up to him and offered to rearrange his bandages. His reply was, "I want a confessor badly." "Is there a priest here?" asked the nurse. Just then, another soldier, lying mortally wounded, plucked the nurse by the sleeve. "Madam, I am a priest. I can give him absolution. Carry me to him." The nurse hesitated. The soldier was suffering from the effects of a horrible shell wound, and the least movement gave him excruciating pain. But again the feeble voice quietly said, "You are of the faith, and you know the price of a soul. What is one more hour of life compared with that?" And the soldier raised himself by a supreme effort to go to the side of his comrade, but the effort was in vain. He had to be carried. The confession did not take long, and the strength of the soldier priest was ebbing rapidly away. When the time came to give the absolution, he made a sign to the nurse. "Help me to give the sign." The nurse held up his arm while this was being done. Death followed quickly for the soldier priest and his penitent. They died hand in hand. While the nurse and the ambulance men fell on their knees on each side of them. The old confessional. How many sins have crossed this little grill that stands aloft alone 'tween heaven and hell? How oft was blood that on this cross lies still, shed on a gaping chasm, ere a knell o'er blasted aeons rang. how oft did he, through these weak pores, soft pass and cancel all that could the demons sate in damned glee at what was not revoked in moments small. Great elegance is not in this wee box that holds the skies at large, yet charged is this, each splinter and each crack, and all hell rocks with irritation strong at swindled bliss, that had no right to be, that should not be, for such dry rot dries not eternity.